Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite our speaker up for closing remarks. Jennifer Windsor of Georgetown University. Ms. Windsor is currently the Associate Dean for Programs and Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Prior to joining Georgetown in 2010 August, she served for 10 years as the Executive Director of Freedom House, an independent group dedicated to the advancement of freedom. From 1991 to 2000, Jennifer worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, last serving as Deputy Assistant Administrator and Director of the Center for Democracy and Governance. From 86 to 89, she worked for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and then Congressman Ted Weiss on foreign affairs. She is a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University and received her undergrad from Harvard University. Please welcome her for her closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much. I apologize because I can't really summarize all that has gone before because I unfortunately missed the first part of the panel. Now I could think about, I was trying to think about and get some ideas about what I could talk about. So I guess I'll talk about a little bit about what I know best, which is the role of civil society in human rights and democratization. And since I just taught a course on the important role that non-state actors play in this, I will draw a little bit on that with your indulgence. So, first of all, as I was saying, this is a huge topic. To talk about the role of civil society in democratization just alone, we could have a whole conference, in fact, a whole course. So, let alone in peace building and conflict resolution. So, but that doesn't mean it's not important. So, a few things. One is that I wanted to share the most recent findings of Freedom House in terms of Freedom House. Probably most of you know Freedom House through its annual surveys, assessments of the state of democratization and respect for human rights and freedoms around the world. Probably many of you don't know that 80% of Freedom House's work and money goes into programs working with human rights defenders and civic activists in the field. So it's an interesting organization in trying to be both an analyst, an advocate, and helping action on the ground. So looking back since Freedom House started doing these kinds of assessments, roughly early 1970s, the trend, of course, has been remarkable progress overall in terms of increased respect for political rights and civil liberties. And Freedom House looks at those issues, mindful that there are a whole range of other rights, economic, social, and cultural rights that are just as important, but the focus of most of its work is on political and civic liberties, and those come directly from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in terms of the areas that are most important. So there's been a lot of progress. It's spanned most regions of the world, except for perhaps the Middle East, and maybe after this year we can talk about the gains in the Middle East. And if you step back and say what has driven most of that progress in respect for rights, it's not elites in government that decide in an enlightened way that they need to give up power and become more accountable and transparent. As much as we always would like to find a benign authoritarian regime, and we know that there are good people within governments that are trying to do the right things, typically all governments resist change, especially change that reduces the power of either themselves or of important political and economic elites that they depend on or have linkages to. So it has been civil society broadly conceived that has brought about change. They've done it in a variety of ways. Perhaps the most obvious way is popular movements that we've just recently seen in the Middle East, but they've also, civil society has brought about that change in terms of, in less obvious ways, whether it's pushing for a change in a particular law, working at the grassroots level to make sure that local governments actually and national governments actually design projects and produce social and economic institutions that serve the interests of the people. And the important role that I think several have mentioned of civil society as a way to educate the population to become more tolerant of diversity and pluralism. Civic groups can serve as incubators and educators, where you could try different governance styles much more easily than governments, which tend to, again, resist change, even if they're, and especially when there's no push from the outside and people stop paying attention. So, again, I'm making sweeping generalizations from 35 years, but so where have most of the gains been made? Well, in the electoral area, elections are much better run than they've ever been. The proliferation of associations, freedom of assembly has clearly increased. And I would also say the free flow of information. It's very hard now to restrict information flows, and which doesn't mean that people aren't going to try, and we're going to talk about that, but it's harder to repress one portion of a population without others knowing. I mean, maybe the only country that we really have no idea about what's happening inside is North Korea. And even North Korea, there's more and more information that's coming out. So this information flow that civil society also helps to perpetuate is a critical role. Now, where the world has made less progress is in significant institutional reform in terms of change in justice systems, in terms of eliminating corruption, the abuse of public funds for private gain. And civil society is in a more difficult, it's a harder issue to push on in terms of changes, because it's not just a passage of a law or allowing this action, et cetera. It's a long-term process that understands how you change the incentives of people that are in the government to do what's better, in this case for democracy and human rights, as opposed to and to actually deliver justice, as opposed to, in the case of a justice system, basically some people are subject to justice and some people don't, depending on what group you're from, et cetera. So we've seen real difficulties in that area, which in some ways is understandable, because the justice system is in fact the epitome of the social contract between the government and the governed, and that the underlying power relations in countries don't change fast. So while we've seen elections, we've seen more groups, we're seeing a lot of opinions expressed. Somebody said previously, well, you always have the right to express your opinions, but we have the right not to listen. Exactly right. So rule of law reform, governance reform is actually about those in governments being forced to actually listen to the voices and do something to respond. And that's going to take a longer time. It's going to take a more sophisticated effort from inside the country to push for those changes. The last 5 years of record between 2005 and 2010, which that's how Freedom House does it, has seen actually more regression in terms of respect for political rights and civil liberties. And the regression is partly in the area that I discussed, the rule of law and corruption. And I would say under the rule of law area, a new element, which is also part of civil society, is the rise of non-state actors that are taking matters into their own hand in a way that's not positive for human rights and democratization. So that would include organized crime and the corrosive impact that has on countries, including in the Americas. Mexico was recently downgraded by Freedom House because of the degradation of the ability of the state to actually keep its citizens safe from non-state actors that are intent on infringing on human rights and democracy, and as well as citizen vigilante groups, which is what emerges oftentimes when states fail to keep, and the justice systems do not have the confidence, then citizens just engage in mass violations and take matters into their own hands. But the two that I'd like to say, and what I think particularly pertain to the topic that you have all been discussing today, are the rising restrictions in terms of the ability of the freedom to associate, and as well as the growing restrictions on both media, including new media, as well as traditional media. And this bears directly on the future ability of civil society to try to engage and to play the role that we know that they have played and they could play in the future. Just 2 points on that. The restrictions on civil society tend to be a lot more sophisticated than in the past. Of course, we still have the mass murderers, the murdering of human rights defenders in Russia and in Uzbekistan. We still have direct repression, but governments have become a lot more sophisticated. And one of the things they're most worried about is how funding flows to non-state actors in their countries. And they have, and I would sort of point out sort of the big countries like China, Russia, Iran, that have been particularly sort of in the forefront of this. They've realized that their own civil society has gained by connecting to the larger international civil society movement. There has been a sharing of information that's clearly happened. Of course, all civil society is local, but those local groups can help to actually become more effective faster because of that transnational exchange of knowledge and outside support. So governments are making it more and more difficult for NGOs, for civil society movements of any type, to get money, any kind of money from outside. That leaves basically two options, right? Voluntary contributions, which we know is not necessarily part of the culture of a lot of these countries, government funding within the country, which brings with it its own problems, or business people or private actors that, again, may not necessarily, none of which, dependence of any of those sources of funding is a problem for civil society to sort of maintain its autonomous nature and to not become just an instrument of some other political or economically powerful figure. So I think that this whole issue of funding and the restrictions on association have kind of creeped up in terms of their impact. And I don't think we as an international community have done a very good job of identifying how to stop that. And I think it's going to be a big problem for us in the future. And then the second thing, the second area I would point to is freedom of expression. And we've seen the role of the flow of information. We've seen whether it's moving from faxes to internet to Facebook to cell phones. So you've seen the ability of non-state elements outside the state to be able to use information flows. But you've also seen really the increased sophistication of governments in trying to restrict that. No one thought it was actually possible to cut off all access to the internet in Egypt. No one thought that it was possible, and they were able to do that. Now, I happen to think that was a counterproductive move because it made Egyptians actually get out from behind the cafes in which they like to write and to send emails and post Facebook pages and get out on the street, which is actually turned out to have a very powerful impact. But what are going to be the implications of the efforts to try to restrict the internet and freedom of expression? And that's going to be something that's, I think, again, critical in terms of civil society's role in the future. I will just make one point, which is civil society is a broad element. But there is a role for grassroots organizations, but there's also a role for organizations that have no mass following at all. And, coming from a group that sees itself as a human rights defender group, most human rights defenders groups have no ability and will never have any ability to actually get popular funding. It's usually a group of very highly motivated individuals, sometimes because members of their family or friends or others have been killed or somehow had their human rights abused. And this set of actors, though, plays a very, very important role. It plays an important role in a democracy as advanced as the United States, and it plays an important role in countries as repressive as Uzbekistan or North Korea. So, I think that as we think about what civil society is and what it isn't, we should think that there is a role for groups that play that role, that function, just a function of oversight. And then finally, I'll make just a few observations. For the last 20 years, my career was really focused on trying to get the U.S. government to take the promotion of democracy, governance, and human rights more seriously. I find myself now wondering whether the explosion we've seen in terms of the foreign policy interest in this, as well as the amount of money flows going into this from governments, including the United States government, hasn't in some ways led to a very difficult situation, which is when governments put a lot of money into topics, they want to control. And so you've seen this encroachment of government in terms of controls, in terms of measuring results, in terms of identifying exactly where the money goes, who it goes to the point that basically groups like Freedom House that have received U.S. government money, but only under a grant arrangement, which means that the U.S. government can't tell Freedom House what to do, have been asked to provide names of the groups they're working with, all their board of directors or all of the individuals, and then there's all these extensive checks for Muslim Brotherhood or other kind of unsavory elements. It exposes those people on the ground to immense harm because that information gets shared with other governments, it gets shared and revealed in public, and it could endanger those people. But it also really gets to the very heart of what civil society is, which is it should be free of government control. And so I leave for maybe a further conference a discussion of what the role of governments should and shouldn't be in terms of funding civil society. We know that the U.S. government and others have played an important role in providing resources to groups that literally wouldn't have been able to get them otherwise, and those groups have done good things. Is that era coming to an end, and what are the implications for that for the future spread of democracy and human rights? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. It was quite a robust conversation. And really, lots of information, very full. So thank you to our wonderful speakers, moderators, and to the Berkeley Center for hosting this wonderful event. Of course, you can find out more about our respective institutions at our websites, the Rumi Forum website and the Berkeley Center website. And there is much reading material out there, so please grab a hold. And thank you all for being with us today. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you.